All right, well, today I'm going to talk about why some of the most gifted premeds and doctors make the worst doctors. Last time I did this, I freezed my face off, and so I got some new additions. I got some gloves. Unfortunately, my ears are cold, so I haven't figured that one quite out yet. But I'd like to start this with Act 1 of 4. The first act is the lie that we sell premeds. And a story that I like to remind myself often is there are a couple of genius anesthesiologists in our department. In fact, the hospital I work at is right in the background. They're trailblazers of anesthesia. They look perfect on paper, and departments are more than willing to pay as much money as it takes to keep them around. But I remember when I was learning anesthesia and I had the opportunity to be in the ORs with them, I never really felt human, on par. They always made me feel small. And it made me feel like not knowing things was a personal attack on my own abilities, my ego. Like there was something wrong with me. And don't get me wrong, I think there's a lot to be said about my generation, the next generation's kind of like softness. But I think this was more than that, genuinely. I mean, I grew up within a blue-collar family, helping my father lift clothing boxes and open the store and close the store in Chinatown. I've been with a lot of people who are rough around the edges. They won't pull their punches. But this was kind of more than that, even. And ultimately, with all the missteps and all the boastfulness, even if they were the department's golden childs, I would never really want that doctor to care for my own mother. I think that's the baseline. Like, that should be the gold standard. You would want someone who you would want to take care of your own mother. And it's obviously not just anesthesiologists in my department, right? There's many doctors. The classic archetype is the surgeon who's just kicking and screaming, the ones that are absolutely awful to their team. And I worked with one actually earlier this week. And it's so bad that there are only a couple of anesthesiologists, maybe less than a couple hundred in the entire world, that have the training to do these cases. And it's so bad working with a surgeon that that anesthesiologist is actively looking to protect herself and find a job somewhere else where she's kind of respected. And I'll save you all the quotes, but it's things like just talking in the operating room, communicating within your team to other teams that set a surgeon off and has him kick you out of the operating room just for opening your mouth. It's the surgeons who, when you're talking to the patient in the pre-op holding area, they step in, cut you off, and say, yeah, well, you might as well come back later because I'm doing my spiel now and I'm the star of the show. It's things like that. And just because they have the hands and the board scores and the reputations, they kind of equivocate that with being like God themselves. I can't tell you the number of problems we've run into because the surgeon was arrogant, right? Like that's the classic tale as old as time. Their passive aggressiveness makes no one ever want to work with them. Everyone's trying to appease them. They're not actually thinking for themselves and what's right for the patient. They're just thinking about what is going to get them out of harm's way, fire's way. And there's very interesting research that bears this out. In fact, our vice chair of research, Dr. DiMaria, recently wrote a book on this and all the research that he's done in this field over the last decade. And I'll share a couple of things that I find pretty interesting. He calls this the impact of incivility. And there's this very interesting study where 76 participants, probably med students or residents, were randomized to a simulation scenario where they would work with a control surgeon versus a rude, incivil one. Nothing like throwing knives and scalpels and cursing, nothing like that, but passive aggressive and certainly less fun, less communicative, less enjoyable to work with. And interestingly, the participants who were exposed to incivility scored lower on every performance metric, from vigilance to diagnosis to communication and actual clinical patient management. So like this stuff matters because it reaches the patients. The patients do worse. The most interesting part of the study, though, I think, is that the self-reported performance assessment between the people who had the incivil surgeons versus those who didn't, they performed actually exactly the same statistically. P was 0.112. And so whatever you want to call it, being incivil, being rude, having a lack of self-awareness, I tell these stories, and we all know these stories, but I bring them up because I don't think that they happen overnight. I don't think surgeons just graduate and then they get to this point and all of a sudden they change their demeanor so that that's who they become. I think they've been this way for a very, very long time. In fact, decades earlier. And this brings me to the pre-med experience. Maybe you know pre-meds that are just absolutely awful. The ones that I remember are the ones who joke about their Gen Chem final being so difficult, even though they got a 97%. Or the ones who post their humble brag in scrubs in a bathroom of a random ambulatory surgical center because they got to shadow their first surgery. But the surgeon is literally like their aunt or something like that. It's this lack of self-awareness that gets compounded over time, and you throw in a bunch of bad eggs and bad ingredients and anger and stress, and you get these people decades later. Like, it's, in my head, not a surprise. The pre-meds and these doctors are tone deaf. They're unbearable, and yet we feel like, I remember when I was a pre-med, why would this person ever make it through the med school gauntlet? And sure enough, UCSF, Harvard, Stanford, right? There's something in the screening process along the way that doesn't capture this self-awareness, and I think it's not talked about enough. We'll move on eventually to talk about where the process does screen for these things, because I don't think it's all a 0% filter. But the reason these people end up becoming doctors is that it's because stats do matter, right? Like, medical school is also a game of privilege, and if you have the stats and the extracurriculars, but maybe you're just kind of a terrible person, personality-wise, you're not self-aware, many med schools are willing to overlook that, whether that's right or wrong. So we know from the data, from the anecdotes, and we also know intuitively, like deep down in our soul, that the best doctors aren't the same ones that can answer every multiple choice question. And we would hope to think that this like holistic admissions process would account for that. But clearly, if time is any bit of evidence, that's not true. It doesn't catch everyone. It certainly doesn't even catch a majority of the lack of self-aware people, I think. So we'll talk about more of that in detail. Let's first look at holistic admission, what it looks like today. So the AAMC, it lists their core competencies, and there are soft skills, things like, service orientation, social skills, cultural competence, reliability, dependability. And yet so many pre-meds today seem to lack these traits in such a laughably bad manner, right? The whole point of today's conversation, also happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, whatever you celebrate, is to talk about this like underbelly of medical school admissions. It's underdiscussed, it's underutilized, and in my honest opinion, it's the secret weapon for all well-meaning pre-meds. The reason you should care about this is that if you're a high-performing pre-med, this will translate to a high-performing career. If you're a mediocre or middle, like not personally mediocre, but if you're middle of the pack or underperforming, again, not personal, but just professionally, then this lack of self-awareness can really get you over the fence. It is a secret ingredient that not a lot of people talk about and not a lot of people emphasize, and yet, in my opinion, from all the students that we've worked with at Premed Catalyst, it is the most important asset in us enjoying and wanting and feeling privileged to support this student, and also, in my opinion, their ability to communicate their life journey, to stand up for themselves and advocate for themselves, for letter writers to support their application vigorously. It's a multiplier for every good thing that you have in your life. So, coachability, self-awareness, soft skills, they don't get the same airtime as your GPA or your MCAT, because your GPA and your MCAT they're numbers. They're easy to look at. Everyone understands the numbers if I give you the scale. They're tangible. You can hold them in your hand. They feel just kind of, sexier. But I'll prove to you that self-awareness and coachability and these soft skills are just as important, in my opinion, more important in your medical school admissions odds and in your career longevity than these stats. And if you choose to ignore them, feel free to, but do that at your own risk, because there's far too many pre-meds that are 3.97 GPA, 520 MCATs that just don't get it anywhere. And oftentimes, it's really not a surprise. All right, so let's move on to Act 2 here. Act 2 is all about what actually makes a good doctor. And I know this really just from looking at applications over the last 7 years of doing this. Every single year, meeting a new cohort of students, a new cohort of colleagues at the hospital for my residents and my attendings, and really getting a sense of what are the common traits that make the best doctors. If you want to just look at the applications, we have 8 applications in our application database, link in bio, yes. Okay, great. And truthfully, I think before I get started, I never thought I'd really be the soft skills guy. Again, I told you about this background. My father and mother have a small store in Chinatown where they sell women's clothing, and it's a tough, grindy business. You wake up at 4 a.m., you pick up the packages from the shipment port. You don't complain. It's a 50-plus pound box. There's stuff to sell. It's 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. every single day, 365 days a year, weekends, holidays. When you get back, there's more things to unpack and bring to the store. Your success in life is directly proportional to the ability for yourself to shut up and do the work. And so for a very long time, I thought that that's really all that mattered. I don't care about your feelings or your emotions. Just shut up and do the work. But as I spent more years working with doctors, seeing more pre-meds go through the pipeline, and I've realized that none of this is fluffy stuff. And there's plenty of real data to support all of this. It's more than just shutting up and doing the work, and I find that many of the doctors that are problematic probably have something similar to that perspective. Nothing else matters, just the result. Shut up and do the work. So we've talked about some studies, but it's pretty clear, I think, after reading some literature, that after some sort of knowledge threshold, a board certification, the many boards that we take, the most successful physicians score very high on things like conscientiousness, empathy, and grit. It would honestly, in my opinion, be easier if the best doctors were the ones that scored the highest on our standardized tests. But our standardized tests aren't that good. They're not that nuanced. Life is much more nuanced. And the MCAT doesn't test how you will perform on real clinical scenarios. What is interesting, though, is that when I talk to people about this, talk to pre-meds, talk to parents, talk to my colleagues and physicians, my hip is so tight. They act like it's this binary one or the other problem. You have to choose either the doctor that's really smart and they know all the questions and all the answers, but they're just emotionally decrepit. Or you choose a doctor that's just very warm and communicative, the one with the utmost emotional intelligence, but they're just like an idiot, and they make all the wrong decisions, and they're dangerous. But isn't that, when I paint it like this, isn't this just like such an extreme false dichotomy? And so many people act like it's one or the other. There's even evidence that academic and emotional intelligence are kind of paired at the hip. The smartest doctors may be the same ones, or the same skills that lead to like intellectual knowledge or book knowledge, maybe the same ones that develop emotional intelligence as well. And there's many systematic reviews, I'll share a couple with you here, that show that the higher emotional intelligence in medical trainees is associated with better academic performance, clinical performance, mental health, and well-being. So I think the first part of this is you have to believe that you can be the pre-med who is self-aware and extremely competitive academically, extracurricularly, letter recommendation-wise. You can have all of it. You can be extremely mentally fit and physically fit and stay in touch with your friends and family. You don't have to choose one. That's a false choice. And again, I think I go back to ensuring that we're talking about this for the right reasons. But even if you're not interested in this for the medical school admissions reasons or the being a good doctor professionally reasons, there's also a selfish reason you should be paying attention to this. And it's that self-awareness is one of the key foundational pieces as used to combat burnout. It is kind of your antidote to a long, fulfilling, or a long career in medicine, which tends to, year by year, kind of chip away at people, death by 1,000 cuts. Understanding yourself and being able to communicate, having that coachability, having these soft skills, that's going to be your armor for a career that honestly is not that easy to sustain for a long time. I'm also in the lucky and grateful place now where I have the opportunity to teach a lot of trainees and kind of pass on what I learned last year to people who are coming in. And many of my colleagues, anesthesia colleagues, love also teaching. And to be clear, I don't have any problem personally with any residents. I think I will say it feels like an honest and genuine honor to share the operating room with people who are eager to learn. But it certainly, on the flip side, also hurts to be in a room with a junior who's defensive, can't read the room, is allergic to critical feedback. I don't know, it's a holiday season, so I feel like I want to be grateful and thank all of the trainees that are on the top of my head that have just made teaching a wonderful experience. From Luke to Chris to Will. Thank you guys. I really appreciate you guys willing to learn and listen and try to become better. But going back to the flip side, I've had many trainees. And again, just because maybe if I forgot your name doesn't mean that I hate you. But there are those doctors that just aren't, or some of the trainees that just aren't coachable. And it's really hard to kind of communicate or share a platform with them. And do I think that makes them worse doctors? Honestly, I don't know if this is a crazy take, but yes, I think so. I think they are worse for their inability and their lack of self-awareness, their inability to recognize that they could do something better. And I can see how ultimately repeated instances of that gets to the patient. I realized that pretty early on, my definition of success was wrong. I thought the success was impressing my attendings with knowledge and citing every paper on PubMed. But that's not my version of success, and I find that for most trainees, it's not really their versions either. I realized for me, at least, medicine success meant that something entirely different, that I could own my mistakes quickly. I could listen when other people who have been doing this for far longer than I am, including my attendings, but including my colleagues and including other auxiliary staff, from the janitor to the techs to the nurses. If they were worried, they had something to be worried about. And I think ultimately, like, being able to say that I don't know and being okay with however that makes me look personally or professionally, as opposed to just bullshitting something just to peacock and flaunt my feathers, that ultimately became like my version of success. And in my head, still, that's at least what makes a good trainee, if not a good doctor, is the people who are willing to set their egos aside and learn to get better day over day, and have the self-awareness to be able to work well with other people. This transitions us to Act 3, which is where the system kind of catches and misses self-awareness. My hands are getting cold and I brought gloves. So, if right now I've convinced you that being bought into self-awareness and coachability, if that's just as important as any other metric to becoming a great doctor, then we have to figure out how our current system assesses and filters for this. So where does it show up today, right? We talked earlier about the AMC core competencies, and they include things, let me read them out, like cultural awareness, cultural humility, empathy and compassion, ethical responsibility to self and others, and interpersonal skills. And schools have been taking that seriously, honestly, right? Think the MMIs, think the situational judgment tests, think the letters of recommendations, and they capture these soft skills reasonably well. As an important aside, I think my MMI at UCLA is the entire reason I got into that dream medical school. And I want to tell you kind of that story. Also, in addition to the MMI, I think it was my letter of recommendation from my PI at UCLA. So I want to share that as well. So let's start with the MMI. So the MMI station at UCLA, I remember very vividly, still to this day, even though it was 8 years ago or something like that. There was a video interview of a person experiencing homelessness. I was supposed to watch that interview and then walk into the room and discuss that video with a faculty member, how I felt about it, et cetera, et cetera. And to set the stage, when you guys interview for medical school, it's going to be probably one of the most emotionally charged days of your life. There's a huge sense of imposter syndrome. There's obviously huge stakes on the line. And for me, it was multiplied by 100 because this was my dream medical school. It was close to my family. I really couldn't afford to mess this one up. And then they presented this video that was just really emotionally resonant with me. And I'll tell you why. We brought up my family many times, and I'll go back to it, but I grew up in Chinatown, Los Angeles. And again, my parents still run this like small elderly women's clothing business store there. And in the corner of our stores, there's this tiny TV. It's above our microwave. And on that tiny TV, when my homework was done, there's a couple hours between closing up the shop, or between just like my parents working and then closing up the shop. Whatever sports were on ESPN, I'd watch. ABC, ESPN, whatever. And I remember when I was young, I would watch these sports with a friend. He would come from time to time, probably a couple times a week, and whatever college football game or basketball game was on, we'd watch it together. I never knew his name, but I knew that he just really liked sports. We smiled and laughed and oohed and awed. And it was just nice having someone to watch it with while my parents were busy. And then I remember one day, I recognized for some reason that he stopped coming around. And I didn't know where he went. And so I asked my dad. And my dad said that he hadn't seen him recently, but in that conversation, he also told me that that guy was homeless and he wasn't sure what happened to him. It was really confusing to me because, like, when I was young, he wasn't my definition of a person who was homeless. In my head, my definition was a person who was, I don't know, made wrong decisions in their life, got caught up with alcohol and drugs and everything in between, and they were dirty and they smelled bad, and when they asked you for money, you should never give them money because they would use that money to go buy whatever addiction and feel that. They weren't asking for food or medicine. They were just people to avoid. But I remember when my dad told me that that guy was homeless, there was huge cognitive dissonance because my friend wasn't any of those things. He was just my buddy who loved watching sports and I hope also enjoyed hanging out with me. In watching that video, walking into that MMI, I cried a lot because in that video, the person experiencing homelessness talks about how so many people walk past him in downtown Los Angeles, hundreds, if not tens of thousands of people per day. And there's a height difference. He's on the floor on his cardboard box, and everyone's walking. And everyone looks down on him. They make eye contact. They read a sign. And yet no one ever acknowledges him. He said he feels like he's invisible. And how many nights he doesn't sleep because it's impossible to sleep when it's that cold outside. For a very long time, I mean, I must have been anywhere from like 6 to 9 years old. I hadn't thought about my friend for a very long time until I saw that interview, and it reminded me a lot about him. It reminded me just how hard it is for some people and how much better, truthfully, they deserve. And I'm not telling this story to peacock or show my values. I didn't walk into that interview being a performative person just to show the interviewer that I cared about people. I could have. The stakes were high. I was trying to get into medical school. But honestly, I was just overwhelmed with all the emotions. And I think that authenticity was a true reflection of my, whatever the AMC core competencies are, my socioeconomic and cultural awareness, my sense of responsibility to others. And that MMI gave me and other pre-med students today a chance to convey some aspects of your character. And I talked about letters of recommendations too, so I'm going to actually read you a part of my PI's letter of recommendation. Quote, "What I love about Michael is that he's completely at ease speaking with professors, probably because he is completely and extremely knowledgeable about a range of topics from sports to politics. In a way, he's a rare specimen amongst millennials, one who certainly embraces technology and social networking, but is also respectful of deadlines and etiquette that means so much to old-fashioned people like me and to patients he will encounter. Michael takes directions well, he actively solicits feedback, and is constantly pushing himself to improve. He's now able to operate independently in the lab. He has always been enthusiastic, hardworking, and reliable. Moreover, he always demonstrated an unusual degree of creativity and intellectual curiosity, frequently asking questions to improve his understanding of the project and the field of study more broadly. He's friendly, he works collaboratively in a team with other members of the lab, and he's well-liked amongst all the members of our research group. One of Michael's strengths, one that will serve him well when interacting with patients, is his gregarious, easygoing personality. He's a lot of fun to have around, always cracking funny jokes, always positive and happy. And I realize how ironically, possibly unself-aware this is, just like peacocking and flaunting my letter of recommendation and my stories. But I want to be very clear that none of this is about me. It's really about the overall idea and the concept that I believe what separated me from other premeds who had better stats and better extracurriculars and better whatever is that I felt like I had some semblance of coachability. I had prioritized and thought it was important to try and be a great teammate, to be self-aware. And I believe that will always be a competitive advantage for anyone applying to medical school, because all of us know what it's like to be stuck on a late shift, an overnight shift with the resident or the attending or a trainee that we absolutely despise because they're just not open-minded or coachable or self-aware. And I think whoever has gotten to this point, this is just an opportunity for me to stand on this platform and share that I think this really matters and we should all be taking it much more seriously. So no matter how competitive you are, from the top candidate in the country to a medium-low competitiveness on paper, your character matters, and you're not crazy to think that it matters. You're not crazy to think that your thoughtfulness, your self-awareness, your coachability, that medical schools find it important, and they're looking actively for students who display that. So remember, the flip side of this is true too, right? We have fourth-year medical students do a tryout away rotation at Sinai. And obviously, if you're doing a tryout away rotation, you clearly want to go to the program, right? And the number of high-stat, perfect paper application premeds who come from the big-name medical schools that don't end up here at Sinai because of their lack of self-awareness, their entitlements, it's staggering. Because really all it takes is for one resident or one attending to email our program director about just the mind-boggling lack of self-awareness, and that's it. That erases your 4 years of medical school, all of your letters of recommendations, all your research, all your extracurriculars. That's all it really takes. So take this seriously. I think there's I'm not going to give too many details, but essentially there's a person in our program who is well esteemed by many, many people. And I think to preface all of this and contextualize this is that you certainly can always have a bad day, and that's okay. But owning up to the bad day is kind of the point, right? And so there's a person in our program who went out of his way, not went out of his way, but who essentially was flippant enough on a shared shift that it caused the other person to work a significant amount more. And when they became aware of it, there was no apology. There was really just kind of like an indifference to what just happened. And I don't think anyone wants to be on a team with that person. It feels like you're on a team with a superstar who doesn't acknowledge that they have to put in their half as well. You feel subservient, you feel lower, lesser. And when your colleagues on an equal playing field, that is inappropriate. And so there's just many examples of how these professional mishaps, they affect your reputation and whether or not people really want to work with you going forward. And these people make it because the system clearly has holes, right? And so there are many non-self-aware people that slip through. One, there's this huge measurement problem. talked about earlier how it's way easier to measure a 521 MCAT than someone who, quote, from my letter of rec, like owns their mistakes, proactively seeks out feedback, and has a genuine desire to be better. One's numeric and the other is kind of like this like vibes scale, right? Two is that there's an incentive problem. Schools are ranked and rewarded based on their research dollars, their number of publications, their match lists, and hospitals make money by the number of cases, right? So there's only one guy that can safely operate on a 2-year-old's congenital heart disease, and he gets the job no matter how incivil he is. It's a supply problem. So there's no medical school or hospital that gets paid for the number of non-burned out, self-aware, and kind physicians. Even though we may agree that that certainly matters and reaches the patients and affects outcomes. Last, I think there's a cultural problem. I hope this has changed, but when I was pre-med, you were kind of clowned if you were vulnerable, right? You'd be the center of the joke if you showed your soft spots. You were soft, and didn't you know that like every pre-med is stressed, so just suck it up and keep going. And man, the number of I scored higher than you and I barely slept 3 hours that I've heard. The pre-med toxicity and the group of young adults just peacocking how perfect they are. And I think we all picked up that if we wanted to socially survive, we better hide our weaknesses than confront them. So that cultural problem is a huge barrier to people taking steps to become more self-aware, more emotionally resilient and intelligent. So, yeah, because of these holes, those pre-meds that are the absolute worst, they will get interviews, they will get into medical school, so long as they have the numbers and the extracurriculars. And even though there are screening points along the way to catch some of the worst ones, the system's imperfect. But even on the bright side, in the last decade, the MMIs, the AMCs, virtual exams, all of that points towards the emphasis of trying to capture some of those soft skills. And this, I think, brings us to the fourth and final act, which is how can I, a pre-med, get more self-aware and build more emotional resilience skills and become more coachable and open-minded. And I think I'm in a strong position to talk about this because, like I said in the beginning, I certainly, when I was younger, and certainly even today, you can ask many of my colleagues, I'm not known for having high emotional intelligence. It's certainly not part of my brand or reputation. But over the years, I learned that I could at least get a little better, that these soft skills were trainable, just like your bench presses in the gym or your VO2 maxes on an indoor cycling bike. And I want more people to realize this because, again, not only do we agree that soft skills matter, but they're not genetic at birth. You're not born with them. You're born at some level, and you have the ability to volume up and scale up and get better and improve. And as corny as it sounds, I think this is the entire point of this video, actually, is to make self-actualization a little bit less corny. We pre-med should want to become more self-aware, more coachable, and we should recognize that it's possible to do over time. And so I think what helps when I was thinking actively about this, because that's how emotionally unintelligent I am. I have to break this down into steps, otherwise I won't understand it. Unlike maybe your friends or partners who immediately understand other people's emotions and can slide in there no problem. I break it down just like in a bench press or an Olympic clean. There are actual behaviors that make someone self-aware, right? One is you have to be able to check in with yourself. You have to notice how you're doing. You have to assess how you're doing. You have to adjust how you're doing if you need to. That first step, just learning to check in with yourself, is more rare than you'd imagine. Most people do not have a moment where they can assess and name how they are feeling. So when you are able to identify your emotional and cognitive patterns, when you get defensive, when you overcompensate, when you're out of your depth, for me, what I found helpful is labeling my emotions. For example, I feel defensive now that my close buddy called me out on my not keeping my promise to XYZ. I think the second behavior of self-aware people are that they check in with others. Once you can check in with yourself, you can apply that kind of similar thinking and just transfer it on to another person. The people we interact with, we can start noticing how our colleagues are feeling, how our professors, our friends and family feel, how they react when we do and say certain things. And that becomes helpful because, again, I think we have all been with that non-self-aware person who also is not aware of how what they're doing is affecting other people. And third is the most important part, which is you can change your behavior. Awareness is obviously important, and it precedes behavior. But all the awareness in the world won't matter if you don't change. And most people think they have to muster this like innate, insane willpower to change. But there's real science behind behavior change, and there are great books out there. Atomic Habits by James Clear, great holiday gift, and Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg, kind of the predecessor before that. But learning how to change your behavior now that you have the information and understand yourself and other people's emotions, that's kind of the roadmap of what self-aware means, right? You can take this abstract, kind of like floofy, fluffy, soft skill, break it down to actual behaviors. That, at least in my head, my emotionally unintelligent head, makes just more sense. That's it. It's simple, but it's certainly not easy. It's seriously way easier to keep doing what you know. Maybe you want to study for a couple more hours so that you can raise your GPA from a 3.94 to a 3.96. Maybe you want to sign up for that Saturday volunteering shift so that your hours for community service go up and to the right. That's easy, right? You've been doing that for a very long time. You know how to do it, so you just keep doing it. But if you're serious, truly serious about getting into medical school, and more importantly, like forget medical school, but becoming a better version of yourself, you'll take this development of your character very seriously. And to just pause on that point here, the forget the medical school point. Medical school admissions is probably the most important thing to you now, especially if you're watching all the way to the end here. But we didn't start this company, PREMED Catalyst, with our sole mission is really not helping people to get into medical school. Our primary mission is to help premeds become the best version of themselves. And I believe that medical school admissions was a huge vehicle to help me do that. And I think that that's the case for a lot of other people too. We built PREMED Catalyst over the last couple of years because we wanted to we honestly feel like medical school admissions is a great arena for premeds to get the opportunity to get rewarded for becoming better versions of themselves. That's why I do this. That's why I care about medical school admissions, because there's an alignment personally and professionally there that I think is beneficial for everyone, as imperfect as medical school admissions is. So, I mean, just at PREMED Catalyst, that's why we really get to know you. That's the entire point. So we have a strong sense of how self-aware and how coachable you are, and maybe over time, especially for the premeds who are already fantastic on paper, developing that part becomes a huge point of emphasis for your writing and your interview prep, because that's like the missing ingredient. That's the chemical X there. So here's your workout plan for being more self-aware, developing these soft skills. One is learn from what you're already doing. You interact with people all the time, every day. And so when you get the opportunities, you get to learn from them, right? At the end of the day, before I turn on my Kindle and I read until I fall asleep, I kind of relive my day. And there are a couple questions that I answer. What did I do well today? What could I have done better? What would the best version of me do? What would they try next time? And what's one behavior that, at least one conversation that I could have done a little bit better? Maybe I was a little short with my partner, or when I was communicating with my attending, I held my tongue because I was a little bit fearful to admit that I didn't know. These things happen all the time. And I think as you reflect every single day, you start becoming more and more impatient and frustrated with yourself. You're like, how is this happening again? So much so that you want to change it and try the next time you're in that situation, try something else. The second part is to ask. And I think today many of our close friends and mentors honestly appreciate vulnerability and honesty. I think that's a great cultural shift that's happened in the last decade. It's really uncomfortable, but I do find it helpful. So maybe sometime you can pick someone you trust and ask them something like, hey, I'm asking you this, man, because I trust you and I think you know me very well. There are some times where I feel like I'm not as self-aware or coachable or empathetic or communicative. There's some soft skill deficits that I have. What do you think that I do like very well in that realm, and what should I keep doing more of? And on the flip side, what do you think that I don't do as well, and where do you think I can improve? It's a super weird question to get out, right? Like I'm even struggling just talking to a camera, much less an active person that has to respond to you after. But just promise yourself, if you do ask that question, that you won't argue with them. You're there to listen. You're there to reflect. If they didn't care about you, you wouldn't have chosen them, and they wouldn't have this conversation with you if they truly didn't care about you. So thank them, honestly, for their time and expertise. Third is to get your reps in. You'll have plenty of stressful situations, and going forward, practice pausing and naming your emotional state and thinking before you move forward. You have plenty of situations, again, every single day where you work with people and have the opportunity to change how you behave for the better. When you take a perspective that's not your own and are able to check in with yourself, check in with them, you can then pretty much 99% of the time figure out what's the next best move that respects everyone's emotions. And again, please zoom out. One, because it's the holiday season and it's a nice reflective time, but zoom out because medical school, and yes, medical school and becoming a doctor changed my life, changed my family's life. But more importantly, and equally important as getting into medical school in the first place, is to not forget the person that you have to become in the process. You have to become the person deserving of a medical school acceptance, deserving of the white coat, in order to get in and land the white coat. This is why the self-awareness, the coachability, the communication, the empathy, cultural responsiveness, all the core competencies, that's why it matters. And if you like this video, Central Park in background with a million people walking behind me, you like this video here about the medical school admissions crisis. Happy holidays. Have a great 2026. I'll see you guys soon.